Huy, miss you na! Tara noon tayo!
Miss you too.
Sabi ko, Miss Universe na!
Miss you na. Nandyan yung idol ko eh. Tara no tayo.
Sige! I am Carl Gillingan, representing femininity!
I am Clarence Culber, representing masculinity.
My advocacy is to be responsible not only for myself but also for the people around me. I believe that this is the key to a better life and better relationships.
My advocacy in life is to have an individualistic life, to be dependent on my own, and to leave things as they are. Sabi nga ni Barack Obama, kung ano ang iyong tinanim, kapitbahay mo ang may aanihin. Thank you.
For your question, what has been the hardest time in your life? Moments sa life mo na not giving.
For me, the hardest moment of my life is nung 20 years old na ako pero hindi pa ako nasa top ng company. Nakakainis. Ang tagal mag-promote.
The hardest time for me were not when people challenged what I said, but when I felt my voice were not heard.
Ha? Anong sinasabi niya?
Yung book niya na about sa women's place in a man's life cycle. So it talks about yung role ng women sa mga create noon na theories about psychological development. And spoiler alert, hindi nila pinagtuunaw ng pansin ang mga women. Lagi na ng men, di ba? Syempre, what is important is it is that we look on both sexes.
Parang ang ganda naman yan. Parang it really shows na yung recent society natin na ganun pa rin yung tingin nila sa kababaihan.
Oo. Do you want to read it muna? Tuloy natin mamaya yung Miss You.
Sige, tara.
I love you and you love me. Ika nga ni Barney. And whether you are a Ken or a Barbie or anything in between, it is our role to show love to every person around us. And one way we can do that is to acknowledge the differences we all have, even though we are very alike.
As we delve deeper in our R11 topic, Woman's Place in Man's Life Cycle ni Carol Gilligan, we will learn about the struggle of women to fit into the structure that several psychologists have made in the image of man. Malalaman natin na kung bakit hindi naniniwala si Diego Loizaga sa marriage na piece of paper pero mahalaga ang pera na papel lang din. Kung pwede nga bang magpa-load sa no-loading and unloading area at kung pwede magsuot ng polo ang mga lalaki sa antipolo.
Without further ado, let's start! Carol Gilligan is an American developmental psychologist born in November 28, 1936 at New York, who became famous for her studies into the moral development of girls and women. She had her bachelor's degree in English literature at Swarthmore College, a master's degree in clinical psychology at Radcliffe College, and a PhD in social psychology at Harvard University. She was first a tutor and a lecturer at the University of Chicago before becoming a full-time professor at Harvard University. At Harvard, she worked with several development psychologists as well, such as Erik Erikson and Lawrence Kohlberg, the latter of which produced a study where she became interested in. She will go on and publish her research, which will be our main source of knowledge today, in a different voice, psychological theory, and women's development. So where does a woman stand in a society where man is the focus? To start, we want to give you examples of the portrayal of women in literature. In the play, The Cherry Orchard, the man is depicted as a sort of epic hero of overcoming an obstacle, which is a woman in this play, in order to be triumphant in the end. This play suggests na pag ang observer ay babae, iba na yung perspective. It tends to be derogatory in some sense. Pero kapag binasa natin, mukha siyang normal dahil nasanay na tayo sa perspective ng man. Furthering into this, the Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White also demonstrated what can be termed as an observation bias in grammar lessons in schools or in ordinary teaching spaces. In the depiction of Napoleon, he was praised for being a great man and all, but when it came to women, they were depicted in an almost derogatory picture in relation to him. Si Napoleon ay interesting and powerful, pero yung mga women were seen as a mess. This represents a gender bias towards male. The sentence used to teach grammar provide a good example of how teaching materials can be biased. And lastly, sa mga religious texts, ay ang story ni Adam and Eve na dahil si Eve ay binuo mula kay Adam, he was seen through masculine clothes and became the deviant. While this may not be the real picture of the story, the problem lies when the female voice has been largely filtered and shaped by male ideas of women.
The concept of being inaccurate in picturing women can be traced back to historical times, but when it comes to the tendency of developmental theories to favor men and not women, may be traced back to Sigmund Freud.
Si Freud ay kilala sa kanyang focus sa mother-son relationship or Oedipus complex at ang relation nito sa kanyang psychosocial developmental theory. Pero, hindi alam ng mga tao is that he failed to take into account the female perspective in his work.
And when he saw that when looked upon the perspective of women, it did not fit his theory, and he saw that developmental difference as women's developmental failure. Even though his studies pointed out that there are indeed differences between males and females, nakita niya lang ang development ng women as wrong or a failure. Freud concluded that women show less sense of justice than men, less ready to submit to the great demands of life, and more often influenced in their judgments by feelings of affection of hostility.
In an attempt to reconcile the differences of man and woman, Nancy Chodorow enters the picture as she stated that the masculine and feminine personality and roles are not dependent on anatomy, but rather because women are largely responsible for childcare.
She states that basic sex differences show up in personality development and that femininity defines itself in relation and connection to other people more than masculinity, basically stating that basic sex differences occur in personality development because male and female children experience this early social environment differently.
In her studies, she primarily cites the studies of Robert Stroller. So he states that gender identity is firmly and irreversibly established in both sexes when a child is around 3, only with some rare exceptions. And since both sexes typically have female guardians up to 3 years old, their interpersonal development is different. Mothers experience their daughters more continuously with themselves, and they experience themselves as like their mothers too. This shows attachment for girls. Thus, female identity development takes place in relationships. While for boys, mothers typically experience their sons as male opposites. Thus, boys in their identity development separate themselves from their mothers. The male identity development takes place in individuality.
Going back to Chodorow, in contrast to Freud's psychoanalytic theory, she states that women do not have weaker egos or are more prone to psychosis. Rather, as mentioned earlier, girls just have more empathy linked to their identity compared to boys.
So, if Freud's description of women are negative, Chodorow changed it into a positive light. Girls experience more of others' feelings and needs as one's own. And because girls are parented by the same gender, they are less differentiated to the world compared to boys. Men define their identity through separation and individuation because leaving their mother is essential to the development of their masculinity. Women define their identity through attachment because staying with their mothers is essential to the development of their femininity. Male gender identity is threatened by intimacy, while female gender identity is threatened by separation. Males tend to have difficulty in relationships, while females tend to have difficulty in individuation. And knowing this, since women are more into social interaction and personal relationships, this is not only a difference from men, but also a developmental liability because the psychological literature suggests that childhood and adolescent development are linked with increasing separation. This is why Freud says that women's failure to separate becomes failure to develop. In order to better understand the basic differences between male and female, let us look at the concept of childhood games and why they mean a lot.
For George Herbert Mead and Jean Piaget, children's games are considered a central figure in social development. They are important because of two things. First, the ability to take the role of the other, and second is to learn respect for rules.
To better understand this in a practical way, let us see an experiment made by Janet Lever, who believed that the peer group is the agent of socialization during the elementary school years. so she decided to observe and study the behavior of 181 grade 5 students who are white, middle-class children, and of ages 10 and 11. She observed the organization and structure of their playtime activities and also observed them playing in recess. She kept diaries of their accounts on how they spent time out of school. Afterwards, the findings of the study are: the first one is, the boys play out of doors more often than girls. Next, boys play more often in large and age heterogeneous groups. Third, they play competitive games more often. The fourth one is, their games last longer than girls, which stems from not only because they require a higher level of skill, so it is not boring, but also because if there is a dispute, which they had more often than girls, they were able to resolve the disputes more effectively than girls. Next, it also seems that they enjoyed legal debates as much as they did the game itself, and even the less skilled in the game participated in these disputes. Lastly, in contrast, when girls have a dispute, it tends to end the game. Lever then corroborated her study with Piaget. First is that boys are more fascinated in the legal elaboration of rules. Second, for Piaget, girls have a more pragmatic or realistic attitude towards rules, or that they were only good as long as the game repaid it. Next, girls are more willing to take rule exceptions. Lastly, girls are more reconciled to innovations. Thus, with this, Piaget says that the legal sense, which is vital to moral development, is less developed in little girls than in boys. Applying it then to corporate success, it is also stated that the male model when it comes to development is better because of the current requirements for modern corporate success. In contrast, because females tend to be more sensitive and caring for the feelings of others, it has a little value in the market and may even hinder professional success. Because of this, Lever says that if women do not want to be left dependent on men, she will have to learn to play like a boy.
To add to these findings, Lawrence Kohlberg comes into picture, stating that moral lessons are most effectively learned through the opportunities for role-taking that arise during disputes. Thus, the moral lessons in girls' games are fewer. Another reason also why there are fewer disputes is because most of girls' games are turn-taking games such as jump rope and hopscotch or peacock, which does not illustrate a direct competition.
To add to the findings of Janet Lever, boys learn both independence and organizational skills. Also, boys typically play with their enemies and compete with their friends but in accordance with rules. In contrast, girls tend to play in smaller, more intimate groups, typically their best friends and in private places. This attitude demonstrates the pattern of primary human relationships, that its organization is based on cooperation. It points to taking the role of the other.
Going further in the adolescence of men and women, another difference that Freud points out is puberty for him brings men libido or sexual desire, while for women, repression, and that puberty brings a sense of inferiority to women.
Another psychosocial development theory that is relevant is the 8 stages of Erik Erikson. The first stage is trust versus mistrust, where the experience of a relationship starts. The second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt, or emergence into sense of separateness and agency. The third stage is initiative versus guilt, where children further move into autonomy or individuality. The fourth stage is industry versus inferiority, where competition with the parents starts. Thus, demonstration of competence arises. Children learn and master their culture. They recognize themselves and seek to be recognized as well. The fifth stage is adolescence, or the celebration of autonomous, initiating, and industrious self. However, here is the controversial and appalling part. Erikson states that this is only for men because women's identity is based on her attracting the man by whose name she will be known, by whose status she will be defined. So then, man is seen as someone who will rescue the girl from emptiness and loneliness by filling the inner space. For him, man's identity precedes intimacy. He already has an identity before entering relationships. While women's identity is linked with intimacy, or she gains identity through relationships. And even though he knows that there are differences in men and women, he still chose to stick with the male model.
Another interesting analysis that psychologist Bruno Bettelheim made is in the context of fairy tales. So pag lalaki ang bida sa fairy tales, sila ay heroic and they defy all odds through challenges and oppositions and emerge triumphant. Pero pag babae naman, they are depicted in a different way, tulad ni Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, na ang main purpose is to marry the prince and not to conquer the world. At kung gusto nila i-conquer ang world, they must at least dress like a man.
Moving on, para naman sa view ni David McClelland, sex roles are one of the most important determinants of human behavior. Para sa kanya, mahirap sabihin ang difference ng man at woman nang hindi pinagkukumpara kung anong better or worse. And females tend to be seen as the worst kasi halos ng mga research noon ay based sa male models. Sinabi din ni McClelland na sa mga men, ang achievement ay may two logical components. Una, hope, success. Pangalawa, fear, failure. Pero sa mga women, there is a third component, which is fear, success.
The problem was seen to emanate from conflict of femininity and success kasi success is seen as a threat of social rejection and loss of femininity. Ito rin ay na-observe ni Martina Horner na women showed anxiety in competitive achievement. Pero para naman kay Giorgio Sassen, this anxiety only exists when the success means another person's failure, gaya nung na-observe kanina sa games. Going back kay Chodorow, she states that men's social orientation is positional, meaning mas concerned sila sa rules, and women's is personal or mas concerned sila sa relationships.
Para naman kay Virginia Woolf, the values of women differ from men and the masculine values prevail. So dahil dito, women tend to question the normality of their feelings and consequently twist their belief and judgment to fit in the norm. So isa ito sa mga dahilan noon at maging ngayon na nahihirapan ang mga women sa public speaking because they were immersed in a culture of self-doubt. Pero para sa kanya, this is a sign of women's deference or submissiveness. So they are more sensitive to others' need, more caring, more responsible, more likely to listen and include the point of view of other peoples in their insights.
Woman's place in a man's life cycle is a nurturer, caretaker, and helpmate. Pero ang man's development ay focus sa individuation based on psychological development theories. Kaya naman ito ay nagiging paradox. Kasi adulthood is often linked to autonomous thinking, clear decision-making, and responsible action. But it is said that this is just because the stereotype about adulthood is just out of balance because it values separateness rather than connection with others. When it comes to women's sense of justice, para kay Freud, ito ay compromise dahil females are impartial. And sa mga studies ni Jean Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg, they just present the child as boys without taking into account women or girls. Pag ang babae ang naging focus ng study, may ibang description ng development na iba sa dinescribe din na Freud, Piaget, and Kohlberg. So dahil hindi nila in-include ang kababaihan sa research nila, that may be the reason for their failure to develop within their theories.
In his study, Kohlberg interviewed two different individuals concerning morality, isang lalaki at isang babae. For the man, morality is recognizing the right of the individual, the rights of other individuals, and not interfering with those rights. Morality is justice, fairness, rights, and the golden rule. But for the female, there are times that opinions are equally valid, but there are times where there is right and wrong. We need to depend on each other, and to do that, we need a sense of right and wrong. Even though what an individual is doing only affects himself, it is important to have a judgment about that because that is the key to a better life and better relationships. This response does not only show a morality of rights, but a morality of responsibility. We should make the line, how can I live without interfering with others, into a better one? How can I lead a moral life including obligations to myself and to others? The morality of rights and non-interference is frightening to women because it creates a culture of indifference and unconcern. And to avoid this, as the myth of Demeter and Persephone illustrates, there is strength not just in independence, but also in interdependence.
Only when life cycle theories divide their attention and begin to live with women as they have lived with men, will their vision encompass the experience of both sexes and their theories become correspondingly more fertile. Some of our takeaways from this topic is that men and women are very much alike. Marami tayong similarities and we share most things in common, but that doesn't mean we do not have our little differences. The studies of Gilligan sheds light on these differences. If we would conform to the concept that the male model is more superior, mahihirapan tayong maintindihan ang side and point of view ng mga babae na mayroong ibang developmental growth compared to men. Freud, Kohlberg, and Erikson were all great developmental psychologists, but they failed to take into account women. And that became the motivation for Gilligan to include girls. Ultimately, Gilligan will then become a significant figure in the feminist movement as well as in philosophical ethics or ethics of care.
Grabe no? Kaya pala ganun yung sinabi ni Caroline Gilligan dun sa Miss You?
Ay, oo nga pala. Tara, nood na tayo ulit ng Miss You.
Tara, tara.
And the winner is Carol Gilligan.
My hope in life is that we create a world where females are heard, given importance, and equally treated as males. At the end of the day, gabi na. And it is our role na gampanan ang ating mga tungkulin. And I thank you!